Rain drizzled steadily over Brooklyn's streets, blending with the distant honking of taxis and the golden glow of cafe lights lining the sidewalks. Inside a tiny corner bakery, Isabel Reed stood behind the counter, her hands swiftly arranging freshly baked croissants onto a tray. The rich aroma of butter filled the space, but she barely noticed. Nestled inside the pocket of her apron was a crumpled letter, creased from being clenched in her hands all day. Final notice: if the outstanding balance is not paid within 10 days, the apartment will be repossessed. The words were burned into her mind, leaving no room for peace. She had done everything she could. Sold her old car, parted with her mother's keepsakes, even let go of the rare books her father once cherished. But it was never enough. Now all she had left were empty hands and an uncertain future. The door swung open with a soft chime, letting in a gust of cold air. Alexander Hayes stepped inside. He didn't belong here. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, broad-shouldered and imposing, he carried an air of effortless authority that seemed to shrink the already cramped space. His stormy blue-gray eyes swept over the bakery before locking onto Isabel. Her breath hitched. Isabel tightened her grip on the dish towel as Alexander approached the counter. He didn't glance at the pastries or the steaming cups of coffee. He wasn't here as a customer. "Isabel Reed," he said, his voice smooth yet commanding. She looked up, momentarily frozen. "How does he know my name?" "I don't believe we've met," she replied, keeping her tone steady despite the rapid thudding of her heart. Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her as if assessing a business prospect. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek folder, setting it down on the counter with a soft thud. "Your debt," he stated plainly. Isabel's fingers trembled as she flipped open the folder. Her name, the overdue balance, the final notice from the bank, everything was there. She lifted her gaze, guarded. "Who are you? How do you have this?" Alexander remained unruffled. "I make it my business to know things." His voice carried no arrogance, just fact. "I'm here to offer you a deal." "A deal?" Isabel almost laughed at the absurdity. "I need a wife." For 1 year. The air in the bakery seemed to still. Isabel stared at him, certain she had misheard. But Alexander's expression remained unreadable. He was as composed as if he were negotiating a contract rather than proposing marriage. "Why?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandmother, Margaret Hayes, is dying," he said. "She wants to see me settled before she goes." He leaned slightly on the counter, his eyes cool but piercing. "I'll pay off your debt. The apartment will be yours. In exchange, you'll be my wife for 1 year." Isabel swallowed hard. She wanted to refuse, to tell him he was insane. But then the image of the bank's letter flashed in her mind. And she knew she had no choice. The wedding was eerily quiet. No music, no guests, just the faint sound of rain tapping against the stained glass windows of a small Manhattan chapel. Isabel stood motionless, clutching a bouquet of daisies, her hands trembling slightly. The dress she wore was simple, bought secondhand, its lace slightly worn. Beside her, Alexander Hayes looked impeccable as always, his tailored black suit sharp, his expression unreadable. He could have been anywhere else, and it wouldn't have made a difference. The only person who seemed truly happy was Margaret Hayes. Seated in her wheelchair at the front row, her frail hands trembled as she wiped away a tear, her eyes filled with warmth as they settled on Isabel. When the ceremony ended, she reached for Isabel's hands, whispering, "You've made me happier than anything else, my dear." For the first time that day, Isabel smiled. A real, genuine smile, but when she turned to Alexander, his gaze was still as cold as ever. The Manhattan penthouse, her new home, was vast, elegant, and utterly lifeless. White walls stretched endlessly, devoid of pictures or anything remotely personal. The furniture was sleek, expensive, yet it felt untouched, like a display rather than a home. It wasn't a place meant to be lived in. It was a fortress of solitude, just like its owner. Alexander wasted no time. The moment they stepped inside, he gestured toward the end of the hallway. "That's your room," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "We only need to play the part in front of my grandmother." And with that, he turned and disappeared into his office, leaving Isabel standing alone in the middle of the hollow grandeur. The days that followed were filled with unbearable silence. Alexander was rarely home. When he was, he buried himself in work, reading the financial news or sipping whiskey in the dim glow of the penthouse, never sparing her a glance. But beyond these walls, he was still New York's most eligible bachelor. His face splashed across tabloids alongside a revolving door of glamorous women. And while Alexander continued living as if she didn't exist, his mother, Eleanor Hayes, never failed to remind her that she didn't belong. "I know exactly what kind of woman you are," Eleanor remarked one afternoon, swirling her glass of wine with effortless poise. "You think marrying Alexander will change your life? Let me remind you, dear, no matter how high a sparrow flies, it will never be a phoenix." Isabel clenched her fists, but didn't respond. What was there to say? In Eleanor's eyes, she would always be an outsider, a gold digger chasing after something she had never even wanted. The only solace she found in this cold, empty penthouse came from Margaret Hayes. Afternoons spent by her side turned into quiet conversations, moments that slowly pieced together a different version of Alexander, one she hadn't seen before. "He wasn't always like this," Margaret murmured, her voice tinged with sorrow. "As a boy, Alexander was full of heart. But Eleanor, she never allowed him to show it. In their world, love was a weakness." Isabel stared out at the glittering skyline, lost in thought. Perhaps Alexander wasn't heartless. Perhaps he was just a man who had spent too long hiding his heart away. The rain drummed steadily against the glass walls of the Manhattan skyline, the city lights blurring into golden streaks on the slick pavement below. Isabel sat curled up in the living room, a book open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over an hour. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Alexander was still out. She had told herself that it didn't matter, that this was just a contract, that his presence or absence should mean nothing. But every time she saw his face in the tabloids, a different woman on his arm, a charming smile on his lips, something inside her twisted. It wasn't jealousy, it was something worse. The door clicked open, shattering the quiet. Isabel turned her head and froze. Alexander stood there. His usually pristine shirt was crumpled, a few buttons undone, his dark hair tousled in a way that was so unlike him. He leaned against the doorway, his stormy gray-blue eyes glinting under the dim lights, but they were not as cold as usual. "Are you okay?" Isabel asked cautiously, stepping forward. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Do you care?" His voice was rough, thick with whiskey and something else, something deeper. He took an unsteady step toward her, and instinctively she reached out to steady him, but the second her fingers brushed against his arm, he froze. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Isabel saw something she had never seen before: vulnerability. And then, before she could think, Alexander kissed her. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate, urgent, like he was trying to silence something inside himself. Isabel's mind screamed at her to push him away. This was a mistake. This wasn't real. And yet, his touch, the raw intensity of it, sent a shiver down her spine. For so long, she had been surrounded by coldness, by distance. But here, in this fleeting moment, there was warmth. There was something real. She should have stopped it, but instead, she found herself melting into the kiss, drowning in the very thing she had never realized she craved. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, Alexander pulled away. A flicker of something unreadable passed over his face, as if he had just crossed a line he never intended to. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Isabel standing in the middle of the room, breathless, her lips still tingling from the fire he had ignited. The next morning, Alexander acted as if the night before had never happened. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak about the kiss. No apology, no explanation, just silence. If not for the way her heart still pounded at the memory, Isabel might have believed it was nothing but a dream. She threw herself into caring for Margaret, who had grown weaker in the past few days. The old woman's cough had worsened, and her frail hands trembled more often. And that was when Isabel realized Alexander was changing. He no longer left every night. One afternoon, As Isabel gently tucked a blanket around Margaret's thin shoulders, she felt a presence behind her. She looked up and met Alexander's gaze. He was standing in the doorway, watching her, something unreadable in his eyes. He said nothing, but the coldness was gone. Yet just as quickly as the moment arrived, it was shattered. Eleanor stormed into the penthouse like an unwelcome gust of wind, her heels clicking against the marble floors. Isabel barely had time to process her arrival before a newspaper was slammed onto the coffee table. Splashed across the front page was a headline dripping with venom. "The unknown beauty, the Hayes family's latest gold digger?" Eleanor stood with her arms crossed, the disgust in her expression unmistakable. "Did you really think you could fool everyone?" she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're nothing but a desperate girl who thinks she can latch onto Alexander and his fortune. You don't belong here, Isabel. You never will." Isabel clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to argue, to shout that she had never wanted his money, that this marriage had never been about status. But what was the point? A part of her had already asked herself the same question. Before Eleanor could twist the knife any further, a voice, low and controlled, cut through the air. "Mother, that's enough." The room fell into a stunned silence. Eleanor turned, narrowing her eyes. But Alexander didn't back down. He stepped forward, standing beside Isabel, not in detachment, not in obligation, but in something that felt almost protective. "Isabel is my wife," he said, his voice sharp and unwavering, "and you don't get to change that." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, fury flickering behind her perfectly curated composure. "You'll regret this, Alexander," she hissed. But this time, he didn't flinch. She let out a frustrated sigh, adjusting her pristine gloves, before turning and walking out of the penthouse without another word. The silence she left behind was suffocating. Isabel turned to Alexander, her heart pounding, confusion swirling in her chest. Why had he defended her? Why, for the first time, had he chosen her over his mother? Alexander exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose as if he had just done something completely foreign to him. Then his gaze met hers, and for the briefest second, it softened. "I won't let anyone disrespect you," he said simply, his voice lower now, more certain. And then, before she could respond, he walked away, leaving Isabel standing there, her mind spinning with one single thought. Who is Alexander Hayes, really? The penthouse had never felt this quiet before. The absence of Margaret's soft laughter, the warmth of her presence, left a hollow space in its walls, one that neither Isabel nor Alexander knew how to fill. Margaret was gone. She had left peacefully, like a fading whisper in the wind. Yet, the silence she left behind was deafening. Alexander had not spoken a word since returning from the funeral. He locked himself in his room and didn't come out. Isabel knew he was grieving. She was too, but Alexander had always chosen solitude over comfort, as if letting someone see his pain would make him weaker. That first night, she knocked softly on his door. "Alexander, I know you're hurting, but you don't have to do this alone." No answer. The second night, she sat by his door, telling him stories Margaret had once shared. "She told me that when you were a boy, you climbed a tree just to put a fallen bird's nest back in its place. She said you were stubborn, but you had the kindest heart." Isabel let out a soft laugh. "She was so proud of you." Silence. But on the third night, just as she was about to give up and walk away, the door suddenly opened. Alexander stood there. He was no longer the composed CEO of Hayes Enterprises, no longer the untouchable man in tailored suits. He was just a broken man. And before she could say anything, he collapsed into her arms. Isabel stiffened, shocked, but then she wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "I can't lose anyone else." His voice was raw, trembling, each word carrying the weight of his sorrow. "I can't. And I can't lose you either, Isabel." Her heart clenched. She tightened her hold on him, stroking his back gently, the way Margaret had once stroked her hair. "You won't lose me, Alexander," she whispered. "I'm here." They stayed there, in the dimly lit hallway, holding onto each other as if the world would shatter if they let go. For the first time, they were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. The days that followed felt different. Alexander no longer pulled away from her. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was softer, filled with unspoken understanding. He came home earlier, spent more time sitting beside her as if drawn to her presence without realizing it. Something had shifted. And then, one morning, Isabel woke up with an uneasy feeling in her stomach. A wave of nausea hit her and she barely made it to the bathroom in time. She sat on the floor, breathless, her hand resting on her stomach as realization dawned on her. She was pregnant. Her mind swirled with emotions, fear, disbelief, and a quiet, overwhelming joy she didn't know what to do with. She thought about Alexander, about how much had changed between them, but she also knew how much losing people had hurt him. She was terrified of how he would react. That night, as they sat together, Alexander glanced at her, concern flickering in his gray-blue eyes. "You've been quiet today," he murmured. "What is it?" Isabel hesitated, gathering her courage. Then, softly, she said the words that would change everything. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, everything stilled. Alexander stared at her, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, he reached out, placing his hand gently over her stomach. "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse, almost fragile. She nodded. And then Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You and the baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're everything to me." For the first time, Isabel saw a man who was no longer lost, no longer trapped in the shadows of his past. He had found something to hold on to. And she knew, so had she. 5 years had passed, and the wounds of the past had faded into nothing more than distant memories in a much longer story, a story of love, resilience, and unwavering faith. Isabel and Alexander had left the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan behind, choosing a quieter life outside New York. Their home, nestled between rolling fields, was filled with light and laughter. No more cold walls, no more loneliness, just a family. Ben, now Theo, had grown into a bright, sensitive boy with a gift that seemed almost otherworldly. His small fingers danced over the piano keys with a grace far beyond his years. "Where did you learn to play like this?" Isabel asked one afternoon, watching her son lose himself in the music. "I don't know," Theo grinned, his eyes alight with joy. "It just makes me happy." That night, as the stage lights bathed him in a soft golden glow, the audience held their breath as the first notes filled the concert hall. The piece wasn't grand or complex, but each note carried an innocence and depth that silenced the entire room. In the front row, Isabel clutched Alexander's hand, her eyes glistening. They had almost lost this moment. And then, from the crowd, a woman stood. Eleanor Hayes, who had once denied Isabel, who had tried to take everything away, now stood still, her piercing gray-blue eyes locked on her grandson, admiration softening the sharp edges of her features. When the performance ended, she approached them. There were no sharp words, no condescending remarks, just a long, searching gaze before she spoke. "I was wrong about you," Eleanor admitted, her voice quieter than before. Isabel didn't know what to say, but when Alexander gently squeezed her hand, she realized it didn't matter anymore. Alexander leaned down, his voice a quiet murmur against her ear. "We did it." Isabel smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. Love had never been about contracts or obligations. It was about fighting for each other, sacrificing for each other, and finding light even in the darkest of days. They had been through everything, and they had won.